If you've been watching our channel for the last 5 years, you know we are all about the camping experience. We bring chairs, for Christ's sake. Finding the best campsite can make your backpacking trip either really, really good or really, really miserable. Here are our tips for finding the best campsite. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. We're going to talk about something that Andy and I are super passionate about, and that's making sure you have a great camp experience. We love the camping experience. Sometimes we say we're out there to camp, not hike. So we put a lot of effort into making sure we have an optimal camping setup. There is nothing worse than hiking all day, being super tired, and not being able to find an adequate campsite and being miserable all night, sleeping terribly, then having to crush miles the next day. The honest take is you're going to spend just as much time at your campsite, most likely, than you are going to be hiking. You want to have a good time. You want to feel recharged in the morning. You want to make sure you're enjoying your time out in nature. So here are our tips to get the best campsite.
Click that subscribe button. Check out the podcast. Check us out on Instagram. We are on TikTok too for the young kids. We got merch, whatever. Support the channel. You know what to do. Thank you for watching. Back to the video.
So you've been hiking all day, you're tired, and you get in what's called campsite finding mode. So a lot of the time when we backpack, actually the vast majority of times we backpack, we do not have a preset camping area that we're going to. The way it works is usually by like 4 p.m. at the latest, we'll go in what's called campsite mode, where we're going to start searching for the optimal campsite. And it actually can get really stressful because we have had a few instances where 4 o'clock rolls around, 5 o'clock rolls around, 6 o'clock rolls around, and we can't find anywhere to camp. And it actually is pretty terrible. So first kind of pro tip is have some sense of the campsites around where you plan on stopping. So an easy way to do that is if you're on any big name trail, like for instance, if you're out on the PCT or the AT, use like Guthook, use guides, maybe even check the forums, but do some research on good campsites around where you think you might want to stop. In fact, plug for Art of the Trek people that support us, go on there, Art of the Trek, people will put in campsites, you can check it out. But first tip is before you even get out there, spend some amount of effort thinking about, okay, I want to hike 10 miles this day, 5 miles, 15 miles. That means I want to start here and end here. And then let's say you want to hike 10 miles. At that 10-mile range, start scanning on a map or forums or whatever and try and find people talking about campsites. That'll save you a lot of headache. So you're out there camping. Let's say you haven't done that, or you found a few campsites you want to check it out. First kind of obvious thing that we do when we get and we're looking for campsites is we look for widowmakers. We have moved campsites before because there were some like sketchy trees we didn't like. We actually have a whole video on widowmakers. If you're wondering what is a widowmaker, it's a dead limb or a damaged limb of a tree that can fall off at night and hurt you. And unfortunately, every year in the US, a few people die from them. Not necessarily at camp, sometimes they're hiking. It's just a terrible thing to think about, but it's an easy thing. We have a whole video, check it out. So we are considerate of widowmakers first off. The next thing we are considerate of when we go to look for campsites, and this doesn't come into play all the time, but lately it's been coming into play more, is proximity to people, unfortunately. This comes into play a lot more in the Midwest when unfortunately, there are some state forests we go to where there are designated camping areas. They're not camp spots, but there's probably like a football field size area where you can camp, or it's bigger than that, but we are considerate of other people. So we don't want to be by other people. We have left good campsites because it was too close to other people, and other people don't want to be by us. So second consideration, proximity to other people. Most of the time, that's not an issue. Third consideration is how the campsite is in relation to the elements. I mean, wind and sun exposure. So, for instance, in the winter, we don't want a windy campsite. We don't want a windy campsite. We're going to have a fire. some ways you can tell if a campsite's going to be windy. The obvious thing is if it's open. If you're tucked down in the trees, it's not going to be as windy. If you, like out in Colorado, we've done this. If you're going out and there's no tree cover and you're on a bald or a pass, it's going to be super windy. Also, sometimes, for instance, by coastlines, it's windier. So when we went and we hiked at Pictured Rocks, we played a little with being by or off of the coast because that creates wind. Sometimes wind is really nice. If it's super hot or if it's really damp and moist, it's nice to have wind coming into your tent to clear out some of that humidity. But generally speaking, we don't like wind, and we will kind of look and be strategic about where we camp based on where the wind is coming from, where we think it might go, if we think it might get windy based on certain factors, but we do take that into consideration. Another consideration for campsites for us, not all the time, but I'd say about 50% of the time, is we generally like to have a fire. And so we look at firewood availability. All campsites are not created equal. We've moved campsites because there just wasn't enough firewood around. So that's an easy one though. When you get there, look for dead and down stuff. If there's a lot of dead and down stuff and you want to have a campfire, I would go there. Another thing you can do is, you see this a lot more in Ohio. We get these like hollows. So kind of like a little ravine where dead wood starts to collect at the bottom of it. So it dies and falls down the hill, and it collects in these hollows or ravines. And sometimes we'll pick campsites that are just uphill of that so we can drag dead wood out of it. And also water can collect down there. So firewood availability is another consideration. I will say though, and I should have opened with this, the biggest, without a doubt, the biggest consideration for us backpacking, and it almost always comes into play, especially out west, is proximity to a water source. This one goes without saying. You want to be close to water. You do not want to have to haul your water up to camp. We've had to do that before. We call them a dry camp. We've had to haul water for the night and the next morning up to campsite. And for us, that's pushing 3 liters a person for, you get to camp, you need to hydrate, you need water to cook, you need water to kind of drink in the morning, and then you need water for your next hiking leg in the morning. So we look for water availability, and this is where doing your research before you go out there kind of packs the biggest punch. So it's obvious. Look for campsites that are by a creek, a river, a water source. Bonus points if you're by like a babbling brook. We kind of like that. We like the ambient sound, but we almost always try and pick campsites around water. That's the biggest factor. Although we've left good campsites that had water because of some of the other things we've talked about. A lot of people tend to camp around water. It can get kind of annoying. So water is what we traditionally aim for. Look at the map, read reviews. If you're going out west, unfortunately, 1, there's a lot less water, and 2, the water sources are not as reliable out west because a lot of them depend on snowmelt, which can vary season to season. If you're out east or the Midwest, we got water everywhere. It's fantastic. In fact, there are some places we go backpacking, like Dolly Sods, for example. We don't even consider water because there's so much water everywhere. There's creeks, rivers, streams everywhere every few miles. Like in the Smokies or in parts of the AT, there's just water everywhere on the east, and you just don't have to worry about it. So it may or may not matter, but if you're going out west, Colorado, California, etc., you're going to have to be mindful of water sources when you're planning where you're going to camp. There's nothing worse than getting to a campsite and the water's dried up and you have to move on. We've had to do that before. Or when we went with Frozen out to Linville Gorge, we were just in campsite finding mode, and like 7 or 8 o'clock rolled around and we just had to dry camp, and we just camped without water. Luckily that night it rained and we were able to use our tarps to collect rainwater, but it really was not optimal. So water is probably the biggest consideration. Another consideration, and this is only going to apply to hammock campers, is trees, obviously. When we've been doing hammock specific trips, we've had to plan whole trips around having trees. We've had to not bring hammocks in certain places because there weren't trees. But Unfortunately, if you are hammock camping and you're going out west specifically, tree availability is going to be a consideration. Like I said, out east here, we got trees everywhere. You don't have to worry about it. Also, if you're out west, just a little note in your hammock camper, generally speaking, the trees are a lot wider, so you're going to need bigger tree straps. So for those hammock campers out there, tree availability will be a consideration when it comes to picking your campsites. On the other hand, sometimes in my tent, I don't want trees. I want to be out in the open. I want to have 360 views of everything. I want to be on a ridge somewhere. So I'll take that into consideration to have a good campsite. Speaking of that, sometimes we pick campsites around the views. Now, it's impossible to do at a lot of places, but for instance, out west, if you're on the Gut Hook app, which is called something else now, I don't know what, you can read reviews and people like say, oh, this campsite has a great view. And we will pick campsites that have good views, because if we're sitting there, you might as well be looking at something cool. Also, when it comes to just general things about the campsite, we will pick campsites that are obviously flatter and that are always going to be in pine forests. That's our preferred location because the pine straw is really soft. There's not a lot of muck around it, and we can kind of get around camp like barefoot if we need to and not have to worry about it. So flat pine straw views, that's ideal for us. Going along with that, we do not pick campsites that have a lot of tall grass or vegetation around it. You can get things like ticks. It can just be super annoying. Like I said, we want flat, cleared out pine straw, no tall grass. Also, we always prefer, and this is a good tip, we prefer campsites that are on slightly higher ground than the surrounding area. The reason for that is I don't want to wake up with a pool of water under my tent or hammock. It's been done before. Sometimes you can't get around it. Sometimes you go to sleep, heavy rain comes in, and you're just going to be flooded. But if it comes down to choice, we are always going to pick campsites that are slightly elevated from the surrounding area so that no water or anything can infiltrate if we do get a lot of rain. Also, and this once again, it's more into play in mountainous alpine areas. We don't like sites, and I would say don't go for sites that have a lot of rocks or jagged stuff around for two reasons. One, if you're a tent camper, I have pierced a sleeping pad and a tent floor from rough ground. And two, it's just annoying when you're like tired from hiking all day to kind of have to pitter patter around rocks. It just sucks. It's not fun. We have moved campsites because they're too rocky. I've popped a sleeping pad from rocky ground. We avoid it at all costs. Go for the pine straw. Bugs are also a consideration. So mainly I mean mosquitoes. So one thing to know about mosquitoes is they don't like direct sunlight and they don't like wind. Out in Colorado, for instance, last year we picked campsites based on avoiding areas where there would be more mosquitoes. That meant getting out from under the trees in the direct sun, getting away from stagnant water sources. We will take that into consideration, especially if it's mosquito season. Last kind of thing I'll say is, and this is not specific to the campsite itself, but we do spend a lot of time on, hey, where is my tent gonna go? Where is my hammock gonna go in that specific spot? Couple reasons. One, we're old now. Everybody snores. I don't want to be close to them. Two, I like waking up to a view. Bonus points in a hammock. So when we get to a campsite, I will make sure, if I can, to orient myself. So maybe my head into my hammock or the head part of my tent kind of faces a cool view. I always try and set up by a running water creek if I can. I like white noise. So even when you go through all this work to find a good campsite, I spend a little bit more time when I get there being, okay, where do I want to be relative to other people, relative to these features? I want a good view. That can also make the camping experience like way better. That is it. I know it was like rapid fire, all these things, but like I said, we like the camp experience. These are all the things we've learned mainly by screwing up. So listen to these ideas. Maybe you have some of your own, but make sure when you go out there, you have a good camp experience and make sure you're enjoying yourself, because there's no point in going backpacking if you're miserable. That's it. See you out in the trail.